Salam alaikum, peace be unto you. I'm Salam Al-Marayati, Muslim Public Affairs Counsel. I'm really honored, real privilege always to have a conversation with Ken Roth. He's former executive director of Human Rights Watch, the premier nonprofit organization monitoring human rights abuses of governments and groups around the world, and definitely have made an impact on human rights for all of us. And he is author of a book that just came out, Righting Wrongs, that I'm sure he'd be willing to talk a little bit about during our conversation. Ken, I wanted to start just, personally on how you got started in human rights work.
Okay, well, first, Salam, let me just say it's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I got started really because of the experience of my father. My father grew up in Nazi Germany as a young Jewish boy and fled Frankfurt at age 12 in July 1938. So just 4 months before Kristallnacht, they were able to get to New York. It was a very difficult process. It took 5 years for them to get out, but finally the immediate family did. But I grew up with Hitler stories. I grew up with what life was like for a young Jewish boy living under the Nazis, dealing with brown shirt thugs in the schoolyard, worrying about the arrest of his father. And that really helped to form me and helped to persuade me that I wanted to devote my career to trying to prevent similar atrocities. And of course, I found that the best way to do that was not just to try to defend the Jews, which is obviously an important thing to do, but to defend everyone. I felt that the Jews would be safest if human rights were strong, and human rights can't be strong if you start creating exceptions for them. And so I became, very dedicated to a principled defense of international human rights standards.
And when did human rights become a public policy and a U.S. policy matter?
Well, that really began with Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. He was the one who first introduced human rights as an element of US foreign policy. And he did that really in reaction to US support for the very brutal coup in Chile of Augusto Pinochet, and also the many atrocities that the US committed during the Vietnam War. So this was his effort to, introduce some new moral element to US foreign policy. It was never consistent. This was still the Cold War. But there was a greater willingness to apply human rights pressure even on right-wing US allies, particularly the military dictatorships at the time in Latin America. And I was in law school then and found this very exciting. This was the new frontier. I think if I'd been a little bit older, I would have been involved more in US domestic civil rights work. But I was attracted to the international domain, and this suddenly made it seem possible. Now, I should say, Salam, it wasn't the smartest thing to do at that point. I signed up for the one human rights course that was offered at my law school. It was canceled. And so to this day, I've never taken a human rights course. I teach two right now at Princeton, but I've never taken one. And I went into a non-existent job market. Human Rights Watch had 2 employees at the time. So I started working as a lawyer. I was mainly a federal prosecutor in New York and would then volunteer nights and weekends doing human rights work, at first principally addressing martial law in Poland that the communist government had imposed really at the orders of the Soviet Union to block the solidarity trade union movement. But I got going. I loved it. I found it very meaningful. And ultimately, when a job opened up at Human Rights Watch, I was very fortunate enough to have been chosen.
Sometimes we look at human rights and we wonder, how politicized it is. So, for example, when Europe was going through the winds of change, we were all in support. Ceausescu was toppled. Yet, when other dictators were toppled, for example, the Shah of Iran, it was not, um, the United States was not so favorable of it. The United States actually, historically, definitely in right after World War I, actually, started supporting dictators in Latin America, in the Middle East. I actually got involved in college with a group called Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. And so that was also looked disfavorably upon by the U.S. government. And what the U.S. government would do would charge these opposition groups with terrorism, that these are terrorist groups. So while we were thinking that we're supporting human rights efforts, we were up against charges of supporting terrorism. So how do you navigate the politics of human rights to counter what governments try to do by distorting it? I mean, from the time of Pharaoh, he charged Moses with being a threat to world civilization. Um, and then number two, how do we encourage people to continue with that human rights effort?
Well, Salam, I mean, you point out quite appropriately that there's often been a huge double standard in the US attitude toward human rights. So even after Jimmy Carter, who came next? Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, you talk about your experience in El Salvador, he backed this awful Salvadoran government that was torturing and disappearing people in the name of fighting communism. He did the same thing in Guatemala. He did the same thing in Nicaragua, but flipped it. He was supporting the Contras against the communist Sandinistas. And so Human Rights Watch, actually with a different name at that point, it was called America's Watch, documented all of this. And when Reagan said we're supporting freedom fighters, we showed that he was actually supporting brutal groups that were death squads and disappearing people. And that was not what most Americans thought of as freedom fighters. And the idea that anything goes in the name of fighting communism, it didn't work. And we were really able to exert very powerful pressure on the Reagan administration to stop. And that sort of set the methodology for Human Rights Watch and really the broader human rights movement, that facts matter, that if you can really spotlight the reality of what's going on and pierce these pretenses that the government is just fighting communism or fighting terrorism, and show that it really is engaging in awful conduct, that's powerful. So today things are actually much better in Latin America. The US is much more willing to promote democracy there. The big, huge exception to a principled defense of human rights is the Middle East. And I mean, you talk about the Shah. I mean, that has kind of continued to this presence. The US seems to be terrified of free and fair elections in the Middle East for fear that more Islamic-oriented governments will take power. And so they are just banking on one dictatorship after the other to keep the lid on the Arab people. And that's why the US is sending billions to Sisi in Egypt. That's why there's a close alliance with the Saudi Crown Prince or the Emirati government. And so we see this double standard very explicitly in the Middle East. And of course, the flip side of that is that whatever Israel does is fine. It can be, bombing and starving Palestinian civilians in Gaza. That's fine, because that's fighting terrorism, And so this is a double standard that remains a serious problem. And, the biggest area by far is the Middle East where this occurs.
Um, so many other questions are popping up, but I don't know where to start, where to resume. But in terms of what's happening, in Israel, and the Palestinians, again, those of us who are working to support Palestinian rights are being charged with supporting terrorism, and that's usually the canard that governments use, is that, well, if you're opposing that policy, that means you are providing material support for terrorism, and that's a serious charge.
Yes.
And we see that that's being used against many of the students that were leading protests on campuses. I mean, what an odd thing that students are leading protests on campuses, as if we never did that in the Vietnam War for civil rights or against apartheid or anything like that. That's what they're doing now. Um, how do we, eh, you know, um, win that narrative? How do we control the narrative that these students are supporting human rights, and not terrorism?
Yeah. No, so that's a very good question. And clearly, the the Trump administration is trying to silence criticism of Israel and is waving the banner of terrorism to try to do that. So I think it's important for us to be very explicit about what's going on. Now, let's first say some students, some tiny minority of students, maybe they like Hamas. If that's the case, okay, they're supporting terrorism because Hamas is a brutal military dictatorship. On October 7th, 2023, it went in and, murdered and kidnapped Israeli civilians. We got to be clear that that's 100% wrong. But to uphold international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, basically the rules of war that are designed to spare civilians the hazards of conflict, that's not supporting terrorism, that's supporting civilians. And we got to make that clear. So the same law that made it a war crime for Hamas to murder and kidnap Israeli civilians is the law that protects Palestinian civilians in Gaza from Israel's indiscriminate bombardment, its disproportionate attacks on hospitals, its starvation strategy, the plan, to forcibly deport 2 million people. These are all blatant war crimes. But if you say, well, that's okay because Hamas is terrible, that justifies what Hamas does because, Hamas will just say, well, we did this because Israel's terrible. And a basic rule of international humanitarian law is war crimes by one side never justify war crimes by the other. And so if they start hitting people by saying you're pro-terrorist because you're just supporting the application of humanitarian law and trying to fight war crimes, you got to come back and say, no, I'm pro-civilian. And, we use the term terrorism these days, I think wrongly, only to apply to non-governmental groups. So, Hamas commits terrorism, but Israel somehow doesn't, and so that's why I tend actually to avoid the term terrorism altogether and just say these are war crimes. And they are both committing war crimes. And we have to be clear about denouncing both of them.
And the International Criminal Court, in issuing warrants for war crimes, they issued some against Israeli officials, but they also issued some against Hamas officials. Sinwar
Exactly.
was one of them.
Exactly.
And I think that's applying exactly what you just said, that you have to apply international humanitarian law equally, which, actually is what our religions teach us. Our religions teach us, oh, you who believe, stand up for justice and be witnesses to God, even if you have to testify against yourself or your parents or your own community. I mean, those are words directly out of the Quran as we're reading it during the month of Ramadan. Yet, the human nature or the human aberration, more specifically, tends to shift that responsibility on one's own community and only point to the other. Um, how do we address that human aberration when we're applying international humanitarian law and applying it, from a superpower standpoint, the United States government, still the most powerful country in the world?
I think you're on the one hand, you're describing a genuine tendency, my side's always right, the other side's always wrong. That's common. But, whether we're talking about international human rights or humanitarian law standards, these weaken if you apply them selectively. And so if there is somehow an Israel exception to the requirements of international humanitarian law, then there is no humanitarian law. Because, if Israel can do whatever it wants, then, Hamas can do whatever it wants. And Saudi Arabia can do whatever it wants, and Iran can do whatever it wants. You can't start allowing exceptions. The only way to have these being strong standards, the only way to constrain governments is to apply them equally, fairly to everybody. And it's worth noting that, the Geneva Conventions were not written by Human Rights Watch. They were written by the world's militaries. So these are not, airy fairy pie in the sky standards. These are the standards that the leading militaries of the world adopted for themselves to avoid repetition of the atrocities of World War II. The Geneva Conventions were adopted in 1949, and this was an effort to say, we're not going back to this era where it was fair game to kill civilians. We are going to protect civilians as much as possible in the context of war. But you can't do that with exceptions. And so there are really arguments of self-interest. If you want to be protected in war, you can't make an exception for your side. That undermines the rules of war altogether.
And what is the status of the International Court of Justice issue that the South African government presented in terms of war crimes and the charge of genocide. Do you feel that that charge of genocide still has standing, is warranted, or is that overplayed? Because I hear a lot, even from people within our own circles, saying that we shouldn't use the term genocide because that takes away support from many in the Jewish community who feel that that's a that's anti-Semitic.
Well, it's totally not anti-Semitic. I mean, there's a lot in your question there, Salam. So maybe let me just take it apart a little bit. I mean, first, just to kind of clarify for everybody who's listening to us, there are two distinct courts in The Hague, very similarly named, both based in The Hague to confuse us. So let's just like separate them. The International Criminal Court, which you talked about a moment ago, is the one that files criminal charges against individuals. That is the one that has charged Netanyahu, the former Israeli defense minister Gallant, and three senior Hamas officials with war crimes. So that's one thing. The separate one, which we're now talking about, the International Court of Justice, sometimes called the World Court, is a court that resolves state-to-state conflicts. It's not a criminal court. But as everybody knows, South Africa brought a genocide case against Israel for its conduct in Gaza. Now, what do we think about that? First, there's a tendency to equate genocide with the Nazis' final solution. And that was, one genocide, obviously. But genocide is, first of all, not simply slaughtering individuals. It's also creating conditions where life can't be sustained. So the mass starvation and deprivation strategy that Israel has been pursuing in Gaza has genocidal elements to it. Second, genocide doesn't require killing everybody. It can be genocide if you kill a part of the relevant group. The definition in the treaty, which defines genocide, says, an intent to kill in whole or in part a racial, religious, national, or ethnic group. And you can have genocide not just as the end, which would be killing everybody you can, but also as a means. And to take this out of Gaza for a moment, what the Myanmar army did to the Rohingya was genocide as a means. They killed about 30,000 Rohingya in order to send 730,000 Rohingya fleeing to Bangladesh. I think that's probably the way to characterize what Israel is doing. I don't pretend that Israel is trying to kill every single Palestinian in Gaza. But if you kill enough, if you create conditions that are horrible enough, the Israeli far right's dream is that suddenly you can forcibly displace 2 million Palestinians, that you will solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem by getting rid of the Palestinians. And I think that that's the way to understand what's going on. So is it difficult for Jews to accept that Israel might be doing this? Of course. Is it an accurate, factual assessment of what is going on? I'm afraid it is.
And where is that case right now in terms of the International Court of Justice?
Well, the court heard South Africa's arguments for essentially what in American terms would be called a preliminary injunction. And the court issued a preliminary injunction urging Israel, insisting that Israel not take certain steps that would have implicated Palestinian rights under the Genocide Convention. Israel basically ignored that. That's not going to put Israel in good stead with the court when it comes to the final judgment. But the final judgment is probably a couple years away still. The court goes very slowly. So they're in the process of briefing the issue now. And it won't be, say, for 2 more years, maybe 3 more years, when the court finally decides, is Israel committing the crime of genocide or not?
You talked about brown shirt thugs in schoolyards, in referring to Eastern Europe or what happened in Europe. Now, black shirt thugs are apprehending students in U.S. college campuses. Lately, the latest one was, I believe, 2 days ago, a Turkish student, and before Mahmoud Khalil, who's probably the most prominent one from Columbia. I think the Turkish student was out of Tufts University. And there are estimates of around 300 students, probably more coming, who are going to be apprehended by ICE, the Immigration customs enforcement arm of the Department of Homeland Security. Is that, I mean, if and the government, the U.S. government is saying these people have not committed any federal crime. They've not um, committed any acts of violence. However, they oppose the policy of the United States and the Secretary of State using a law, an ancient law, or a McCarthy law, the McCarran-Walters Act, has the right to take away their immigration status, and one of them was a green card holder, Mahmoud Khalil. The other one was a student visa status. So is that something that you would consider a human rights violation, or at least something that we should look at in terms of human rights, not just civil rights?
Absolutely. And let me explain. Um, what's going on here, just to be clear, this is an effort to censor criticism of Israel. And all of these students are in the United States legally. So this is not a matter of undocumented immigrants. They all have valid visas. As you note, Mahmoud Khalil had a green card. The First Amendment applies to anybody in the United States. So it's not limited to citizens. All of these students have First Amendment rights to free expression. And how is the government circumventing that? They're invoking a law that gives the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the power to deport non-citizens if they do something that is contrary to U.S. foreign policy, that somehow undermines U.S. foreign policy. Now, it's not meant to be an exception to the First Amendment, but it's supposed to be narrowly focused on something that harms U.S. foreign policy. Now, it is preposterous to say that engaging in a demonstration on a campus or writing an op-ed in the student newspaper undermines U.S. foreign policy. In fact, nobody anywhere in the world probably knew about it until Trump started deporting these people. So this is just using this pretext, really designed for wartime, to deport people just because they disagree with Trump's, his deference to Netanyahu. And that is blatantly wrong. I doubt the courts are going to uphold this. I mean, even though the US government does have kind of greater latitude in the deportation context, this is so clearly a pretext just to silence criticism of Israel that I'm guardedly optimistic the Trump administration will not get away with it. Now, it's worth, if I could, to just address one other argument, because one thing that's repeatedly said is that these people were anti-Semites. They were engaged in anti-Semitic comments or protests or what have you. And let's first recognize that there were isolated incidents of anti-Semitism. So I can't say that every single student protester was pure as the snow, but the vast majority were just protesting Israeli war crimes in Gaza, which is a completely legitimate thing to do. Now, some people who want to stop those protests are saying those are anti-Semitic. And we should be clear what's going on with that, because anti-Semitism is a genuine problem around the world, and it is accelerated in recent years. If people begin to think that charges of anti-Semitism are just an excuse to censor criticism of Israel, that cheapens the concept of anti-Semitism at a point when Jews need it. And what it's basically doing is selling down the river Jews who live around the world to try to protect the Netanyahu government. So this is harming Jews. I don't even think it's good for Israel, because it just generates cynicism toward the Israeli government. But it is certainly harmful to Jews. So if you ever hear these anti-Semitism allegations, it's always worth asking, so what are we talking about here? And certainly the people who are being deported, there's zero showing that any of them engaged in any act beyond criticism of Israel. And if this is all about silencing criticism of Israel, which is what, by the way, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism effectively does, it encourages censorship of criticism of Israel in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. That's why it's such a horrible definition. We got to point that out and say you are harming the fight against anti-Semitism in the process of misusing these charges to defend Israeli misconduct.
Is there an alternative to the IHRA definition of
There
anti-Semitism
is.
used with the
There
government?
is, and there are two good alternatives. One is
Yes.
called the Jerusalem Declaration. The other is called the Nexus Document. And what makes them superior is that both of those, while their positive definition of anti-Semitism is quite similar, and nobody really quarrels with that, they include examples of things that are not anti-Semitism, including basically legitimate criticism of Israeli conduct. And that's appropriate because it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israeli misconduct. But the IRA definition does not include these examples. It just has this broad definition that, for example, says it's anti-Semitic to accuse the Israeli government of racism. So if you say that the Israeli government is committing the crime of apartheid in the occupied territories, which it clearly is, I mean, even the International Court of Justice found that this summer. Human Rights Watch found it a few years ago. Every serious human rights group that has looked at the issue has found it. That's supposed to be anti-Semitic? No, that's about just like censoring criticism of Israel. So now, even though the IRA definition is built as a working definition, have they amended it in light of this repeated misuse of the definition to silence critics of Israel? No, because that's the point at this stage. That's why defenders of the Israeli government like the IRA definition. They want to misuse it. And so I think we just have to call it out. We have to say, stop cheapening this important concept. If you're really worried about protecting Jews, have a proper definition of anti-Semitism and don't use the fight against anti-Semitism to silence criticism of atrocities by the Netanyahu government.
And you have said in the past that your job is to create enemies among these government leaders and shine the light on their abuses. How do we do that when our own government, the United States, is complicit at the very least with war crimes that are happening, not just in the Middle East, but in several spots of the world?
Well, if I can amend this a little bit, I mean, my job isn't to make enemies, but a byproduct of my job is that I often.
Okay.
Let's put it that way. My job is to uphold human rights, and I criticize governments, and they don't like it, so I become their enemy. But that's not the intent; it's just the effect. But how do we deal with U.S. complicity in war crimes? I think first of all, pointing it out. I mean, just to give you an example, these huge 2,000-pound bombs that are U.S. made, and Israel was dropping them, decimating Palestinian neighborhoods in Gaza. These kill people, within a 2 football field radius from their point of hitting the ground. And it's clearly the crime of indiscriminate bombardment. Now, Biden recognized that, and he suspended delivery of those weapons. Trump has now reinstated delivery. And so if Israel starts using these weapons again, we have to stress that it's not just the Israeli government that's committing war crime. It's Trump who is aiding and abetting them. And there's a precedent for that. There was a president of Liberia a few years ago called Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor provided arms to an awful rebel group in neighboring Sierra Leone. He was convicted by an international tribunal of aiding and abetting war crimes and is now serving a 50-year prison term in a British prison. So now, do I think Trump's going to be locked up tomorrow? No. But nonetheless, we have to be clear that aiding and abetting criminality is criminality. Providing the means to commit atrocities is being complicit in those atrocities. And we have to stress that over and over. And that may not, persuade Trump's hardcore base, but that's not really our job. The job is to focus on people who are in the movable middle. And I do think that a majority of Americans don't want their government complicit in mass atrocities. We need to keep stressing that that's what's going on and press for it to end.
I know we're out of time, but I have to ask you about suspending USAID by this administration and its impact on our work for human rights. To many people that that don't really follow human rights, they think that USAID is a waste. It's as I think, was it JD Vance or who, some U.S. official says, well, we were sending condoms to Hamas.
Making that up. I know,
yeah, making stuff up. But most people don't think that it really helps American interests, doesn't help them, so they don't care if USAID is eliminated from the U.S. government programs. And so how do we educate people about the importance of these arms within U.S. government that are intended to support human rights?
Well, first of all, I mean, in terms of just even narrow self-interest, I mean, USAID funds, education efforts, sanitation efforts, public health around the world. And so, for example, Trump is decimating the World Health Organization's ability to monitor and fight against infectious disease threats. And so, the next time something pops up, whether it's Ebola in Africa or, an evolution in the bird flu or antimicrobial resistance, these are threats that, once they're out of control, which, USAID used to prevent from happening, but now is just ceding the field to the viruses. This is going to harm Americans because it's not as if some infectious disease respects international borders. It doesn't have a passport. It doesn't bother with a visa. They just cross over. In today's interconnected worlds, they come here. And, Trump is just exposing us by dropping the frontline defenses to our public health. So, that's just a kind of a self-interested issue. But what USAID also funds, and I think is what you're alluding to, Salam, is that, it funds a bunch of things that autocrats hate. Autocrats try to undermine the checks and balances on their power. USAID funded independent journalists, democracy promoters, human rights defenders, the kind of, people who break the censorship, break the one-dimensional information environment that autocrats try to create. And so Trump's giving a gift to the world's autocrats. He's doing worse than that because, these very powerful independent voices like Voice of America or Radio Free Asia, Trump is trying to shut them down. I mean, can you imagine how they're toasting champagne in Beijing? Here they've been trying for years through censorship to prevent the Chinese people from learning the truth and trying to, block Voice of America and block Radio Free Asia. And Trump says, oh, don't worry, Xi Jinping, I'll do it for you. I'll just shut it down. That's what's going on here. And, we all understand that Trump has this, awful admiration for autocrats because he wishes he could become one too. He admires their ability to operate without pesky things like independent judges or, critical journalists or civic society that speaks the truth about what he's doing. So, with admiration for their power, he's trying to set that up at home. But in the meantime, he's making it easier for them to operate by killing these important sources of independent information, which are, they are the biggest threat to autocrats around the world. And Trump is just getting rid of them.
Well, Ken, I mean, this has been extraordinary that, your ability to help us understand not only the importance of human rights, but its repercussions on our daily lives. You had said that Jews are safest when human rights is strong, and that applies to Muslims as well.
Absolutely.
To all of us. And our first order of business is to make sure that we are on the side of human rights and not preventing it, not preventing its application. So I thank you for that. I feel like I have to pay tuition now for this class that you gave us in just 30 minutes, and I'd love to take your class. I don't know if it's in Princeton or.
It's all in my book. I just encourage people. It's called Right and Wrongs. You can get it in your local bookshop or order on Amazon or whatever. But I outline a lot of that there.
And I was going to say we all need to buy your book, and hopefully we'll have a book event. Wherever you are, we'll ask to be signed up for one of your tour stops, and love to continue this conversation.
Fantastic.
Thank you. You take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.